The grocery store on Maple Avenue wasn't anything special. It was the kind of place people visited without thinking twice: bright aisles, quiet music, and the faint hum of refrigerators lining the back wall. On weekday mornings, it was filled with retirees buying their usual bread and milk, mothers pushing carts with sleepy children, and workers grabbing coffee before heading to their jobs. It felt safe, familiar, ordinary, the kind of space where you'd expect nothing out of the ordinary to ever happen. But that illusion of calm can break fast. Sometimes all it takes is one person's anger, one cruel moment, to turn a peaceful place into something ugly and unforgettable. That morning was sunny but cool, a soft breeze moving through the parking lot as people went about their routines. Inside, the lights reflected off polished floors, and the scent of ripe fruit and cleaning supplies mixed in the air. Near the entrance stood the automatic doors that opened with a quiet whoosh every few seconds, letting in a patch of sunlight each time someone entered. Most shoppers were regulars, people who nodded politely at the cashiers, people who knew which aisles carried the cheapest deals. Among them that morning was an older man named Thomas, though most who knew him simply called him Mr. Grant. He was in his late 70s, tall but slightly bent at the shoulders, always dressed neatly, the kind of man who believed in wearing a hat even when running small errands. He came every Wednesday around the same time, usually for the same few items: bread, eggs, coffee, and a small treat for his granddaughter who lived with him since her parents had passed. The store staff liked him. He was soft-spoken, patient, always greeting them with a warm good morning. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice. That same morning, another regular walked through those doors, Karen Mitchell. She was in her early 40s, wearing sunglasses despite the soft indoor lighting, her hair pulled tightly back. She carried herself with a confidence that often came across as arrogance. She lived only a few blocks away in a small but well-kept home, often seen walking her dog or talking loudly on her phone in the aisles. The employees knew her too, but not for kindness. Her voice was sharp, her temper quick. She had a habit of snapping at cashiers over small things, of cutting in line, of glaring at anyone she thought moved too slowly. For most people, she was just a difficult customer, one of those faces you tried to avoid if you saw her in the same aisle. But behind that bad attitude was something deeper. Neighbors whispered that she'd been through a messy divorce, that she'd lost her job last year and was living off her savings. Those who'd seen her alone in her car sometimes noticed her crying, gripping the steering wheel like she was holding on to the last bit of control she had. But in public, she was all pride, snapping at clerks, scolding strangers, insisting she was right about everything. At that hour, the store was quiet. The background music played softly, some forgotten song from the 70s. The hum of refrigerators filled the silence between conversations. Thomas pushed his cart slowly, humming to himself as he checked the expiration dates on milk cartons. He looked peaceful, the way someone looks when their morning follows a familiar rhythm. A few aisles away, Karen tossed items into her cart with short, annoyed movements, sighing each time something wasn't where she thought it should be. For a moment, their paths crossed in the produce section. It was small and crowded with boxes of oranges and apples stacked high. Karen stood by the bananas, talking to someone on her phone, her tone impatient. Thomas, as usual, was polite, waiting for her to move before reaching for the apples beside her. But she didn't notice him, or maybe she did and just didn't care. He gave a small, polite cough, the kind people make to quietly get someone's attention. That's when she looked at him. The moment was brief, but something in her expression shifted, irritation flashing behind her sunglasses. It was the kind of glare that made people shrink back, though Thomas didn't react. He simply smiled faintly, said, "Excuse me, ma'am," and reached for his apples. That should have been the end of it. Just two people, strangers, sharing the same space for a few seconds. But something lingered in the air, a tension no one else noticed. She turned away sharply, muttering something under her breath. To the other shoppers, it seemed like nothing. Just another small encounter between strangers in a grocery store. Yet sometimes, it's those small, passing moments that stick with people, that settle deep in their chest and grow heavier as the day goes on. For Karen, that moment festered like a wound she couldn't stop picking at. Outside, the morning moved on as usual. A mother struggled to load groceries into her car while calming her crying toddler. A man returned a shopping cart to the rack. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But inside, behind those glass doors, something was brewing, quiet and poisonous. The store employees would later recall that Karen seemed tense that morning, snapping at the cashier over a coupon that had expired, complaining that the line was moving too slowly. Others noticed her muttering angrily as she her groceries. It wasn't unusual for her to lose her temper, but something about that day felt different. There was an edge in her voice, a trembling in her hands, as if she was carrying anger too heavy for such a simple morning errand. Thomas, on the other hand, continued his routine, unaware that his brief, polite interaction had somehow triggered something dark in her. After paying, he carefully packed his groceries, nodded to the cashier, and walked toward the exit. He had no idea that within minutes, he'd become the center of a storm he never saw coming, a storm born not from reason but from hate. Outside, the sun had risen higher, washing the parking lot in bright light. The wind rattled a few carts, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline and dust. It looked like an ordinary morning in every way, yet, beneath the surface, something ugly waited to break through that calm. What began as just another day at the grocery store was about to turn into something much darker, something that would be captured on shaky phone videos, replayed in news reports, and burned into the memories of everyone who witnessed it. People often say you never know when something terrible will happen, that life can change in the space of a single heartbeat. For everyone inside that grocery store, that truth was about to come alive, loud, chaotic, and cruel, tearing through the illusion of normal life in a way none of them could ever forget. The hours after that brief encounter in the grocery store should pass like any other day. But for Karen, they didn't. As she sat in her car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, she could still see his face, that old man's calm, polite expression. To her, it wasn't just a harmless look. In her mind, it was something else, a judgment, a reminder of how far her life had fallen. She stared out at the people walking past her car, her jaw tight, her thoughts spinning faster and darker. She felt wronged, humiliated, and she couldn't explain why. It wasn't the man's fault, but she needed someone to blame, and he was the easiest target. Over the past year, Karen's life had slowly come apart. The divorce had left her bitter and angry, not only at her ex-husband, but at the world. He'd left her for a younger woman, and she'd lost not just her marriage, but her sense of power. Her job at the marketing firm hadn't lasted long either. She'd been fired after an argument with her supervisor that turned loud enough for half the office to hear. Bills had started piling up, and she'd sold her jewelry to make rent more than once. But what hurt most was the silence, the slow fatting of friends who didn't know what to say anymore, neighbors who avoided her calls, family members who'd grown tired of her complaints. Karen had always needed to feel in control, and when life stripped that away, anger became her shield. Every time someone didn't meet her expectations, a cashier, a stranger, even a delivery driver, she lashed out. The world, she believed, owed her something for all the wrong it had done. That morning at the grocery store had caught her on one of her worst days. The night before, she'd argued with her landlord about another late payment. She'd gone to bed furious, replaying old grudges in her head until sunrise. Seeing Thomas that morning, calm, collected, smiling like the world was still kind, stirred something ugly in her. It reminded her of everything she was. He looked too at peace, too sure of himself, and she hated it. Back inside the store, the staff went about their work, unaware that Karen's anger hadn't faded. In fact, it was growing. When she spotted Thomas again near the exit, she narrowed her eyes. He stood there, speaking softly with the cashier, probably about something trivial, but to Karen it looked smug, like he was showing off. She muttered to herself, her voice low and bitter, "People like him think they can just do whatever they want." Thomas, meanwhile, had no idea that he had become the center of someone's quiet rage. He was thinking only about heading home, about how his granddaughter loved the smell of fresh apples, how she'd smile when he brought them in. He had lived long enough to know that patience and kindness cost nothing. But he also lived in a world that was changing, one that sometimes punished people for trying to be kind. When the confrontation finally happened, it started small. Karen walked out just behind him, both of them pushing carts toward their cars. Thomas's trunk was open, and he was carefully placing his bags inside. Karen's cart rolled a little too close and brushed against his bumper. The sound was soft, barely a tap, but she froze, her eyes flashing with irritation. "Watch where you're going," she snapped. Thomas turned, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't see you there." His voice was calm, gentle even, but that only made her angrier. She stepped closer, her voice rising. "Yeah, sure you didn't. You people never do." Her tone changed the air between them. There was venom in her words, the kind that wasn't about the cart at all. Thomas frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "I don't think I understand," he said softly. Karen scoffed. "Of course you don't, always pretending to be polite." A few people nearby turned to look. The parking lot seemed to hold its breath. Thomas didn't want trouble, he'd seen enough of it in his lifetime, so he simply nodded and said, "You have a good day, ma'am," before closing his trunk. But that only fueled her. She hated that calmness. She wanted a reaction, a reason to release everything she'd been carrying inside. Instead, he gave her peace, and that peace felt like a mockery. She spat words at him that made people gasp, cruel, racist things that cut through the quiet morning like a blade. The witnesses would later say that Thomas didn't raise his voice once. He just stood there, still and quiet, letting her words hit the air around him. Then slowly, he shook his head and said something simple, something that only made her angrier. "I'll pray for you." Those words, meant as kindness, hit her like an insult. In her mind, they sounded condescending, like pity. She pushed her cart forward, hitting his leg. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the trunk. Gasps rippled through the small crowd gathering nearby. "Hey, that's enough," someone shouted. Karen's face was red now, her voice trembling with rage. "He started it. He got in my way," she yelled, pointing at Thomas, but no one believed her. A few people pulled out their phones, recording what was unfolding. The sight of those cameras made her voice even louder, more desperate. "Stop recording me, you don't know what happened." Thomas stood there quietly, his eyes sad more than angry. He didn't speak again. He just wanted to leave, to get away from the noise. But by then, things had gone too far. The store manager rushed outside, trying to calm the situation, while another employee called the police. Karen's words grew sharper, more hateful, as if she couldn't stop herself. She hurled one last insult, one that made even those filming lower their phones for a moment. Then she shoved the old man again. This time he lost his balance and fell against the cart, knocking his groceries to the ground. The sound of apples rolling across the asphalt echoed in the silence that followed. The manager stepped in, pulling her back. Thomas tried to sit up, breathing heavily, his hand shaking as he steadied himself. A woman ran to help him, kneeling beside him with tears in her eyes. The police arrived minutes later. By then, most of the crowd had gathered around. Some people were angry, shouting at Karen, calling her out for what they'd just seen. She tried to defend herself, saying she'd been provoked, but no one listened. The officers separated them, taking statements. One officer spoke to Thomas gently, helping him to his feet, while another guided Karen toward a squad car. As they led her away, she shouted over her shoulder, her voice hoarse and trembling, "This isn't fair, he started it, you're all against me." But her words fell flat. The videos were already online. The truth, caught on camera, was spreading faster than she could deny it. What no one saw, though, was the moment after the chaos, when Thomas sat on the curb, breathing slowly, staring at the broken apples beside him. He didn't cry or speak. He just looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying the weight of years of quiet disrespect, the kind that never really goes away. Back at the station, Karen's anger began to fade, replaced by fear. She'd seen the officers glance at each other as they watched the video. She knew it didn't look good. The internet had already turned her into something she couldn't control, a villain in a story everyone wanted to hate. But in her mind, she was still the victim. She told herself she'd been pushed too far, that people were twisting the truth. Yet deep down, somewhere beneath the layers of denial, she knew the truth. The anger wasn't new. It had been living in her for years, waiting for a reason to explode. That morning, it finally did. Over the next few days, the world around her collapsed even further. Her name trended online. Neighbors refused to look at her. Her landlord sent an eviction notice and her phone filled with messages, some cruel, some demanding answers. She didn't respond to any of them. She just sat in her kitchen, staring at the wall, listening to the echo of her own voice from that morning, wishing she could take it back, but too proud to say it out loud. For Thomas, life went on quietly but not unchanged. The bruises faded, but the memory didn't. He tried to forgive her, to find peace again in his routines, but something inside him had shifted. The store didn't feel the same anymore. The aisles felt colder, the faces more distant. Each time he stepped through those automatic doors, he felt the echo of that morning, not just the pain, but the disbelief that such hatred could still exist so openly. In the days that followed, the police finished their investigation and the charges were made public. Assault, hate crime, disorderly conduct. The headlines were everywhere. Woman arrested for racist attack on senior black citizen. The story spread faster than she could hide from it. Every detail of her life was picked apart, her divorce, her job loss, her angry posts online. The world saw her not as a struggling woman, but as a symbol of something larger, the ugliness that still lingered beneath the surface of ordinary life. And that's what made it all so tragic. Because underneath the shouting and the headlines, there was a deeper truth, a life consumed by bitterness, another wounded by hate, and a society forced once again to look at itself in the mirror and ask how such cruelty still finds its way into simple, everyday places like a grocery store parking lot. The tension that had started with a look, just one quiet passing glance, had grown into something monstrous. And as the dust settled, no one involved could go back to who they were before. The afternoon sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the grocery store parking lot. The heat shimmered off the cars, blurring the edges of the world like a mirage. It should have been another quiet day, people going in and out with carts full of groceries, the faint sound of traffic humming from the street. But beneath that ordinary calm, something dark was building again. It had been 3 days since the first altercation. 3 days had passed since Karen's outburst had gone viral. The video, shaky, filmed from a stranger's phone, had spread across every social media platform within hours. She watched herself on screen, screaming, shoving, her face twisted in rage. Each time she saw it, she barely recognized the person in the video. But instead of remorse, she felt something else, humiliation. She couldn't step outside without seeing people whispering. Her phone didn't stop buzzing, messages from news outlets, hate comments, old acquaintances telling her she'd gone too far. Her world had shrunk to the size of her living room. Curtains drawn, phone off, thoughts circling endlessly. By the third night, she hadn't slept properly in days. Her mind felt foggy, her chest tight. Every knock on the door made her flinch. Every sound from the street made her think someone was coming for her. And yet, deep inside, there was something that refused to accept blame. She told herself she'd been provoked, that she wasn't a monster. She repeated it over and over until it sounded like the truth. But the truth didn't go away. It followed her everywhere, in her reflection, in the news, in the silence that filled her house. The anger that had first exploded in that parking lot hadn't burned out. It had only changed shape. It had become desperation. That morning, she decided to leave the house. She told herself she just needed groceries, something normal to do. Maybe if she went back to the store, people would see that she wasn't hiding. Maybe she could reclaim her place, prove to herself she was still in control. She pulled on a baseball cap and dark sunglasses, hopping to blend in. Her hands shook slightly as she locked the door behind her. As she drove down Maple Avenue, she noticed the for sale signs on neighbors' lawns, the kids playing near the sidewalk, ordinary things that made her feel even more like an outsider. When she reached the store, her stomach twisted. The sight of the building made her breath catch. The last time she'd been there, she'd been screaming, surrounded by police and flashing lights. But she forced herself to park and step out. Her heels clicked against the asphalt, echoing in her head like gunshots. Inside, it was quieter than usual. A few people recognized her right away. Whispers started in the aisles, glances exchanged. She pretended not to notice, clutching a basket, walking faster. The weight of their stares felt like pressure on her back. And then fate or something brought him back too. Thomas was there by the coffee section, moving slowly as he read the labels. He looked tired but peaceful, the way someone looks after deciding to let go of something painful. He didn't expect to see her again. When he turned and saw her standing at the end of the aisle, he froze for a moment, not out of fear, but shock. Their eyes met. For a long, heavy second, neither moved. Then Thomas gave a small nod, polite as always, as if to say he wished no trouble. But to her, that nod felt like a knife. It wasn't forgiveness she saw, it was pity. Something inside her cracked. She turned down the aisle, walking straight toward him, her face tense. "You shouldn't be here," she muttered, her voice low but sharp. Thomas sighed. "Ma'am, I have every right to be here. Let's just go our separate ways." But his calm only made it worse. Her voice rose. "You ruined my life," she shouted, heads turned. A mother pulled her child closer. "Because of you, everyone thinks I'm—" She stopped herself, choking on the words. Thomas took a step back, his hand slightly raised. "Please," he said quietly, "let's not do this again." Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. The music, the whispers, the creak of the shopping carts. Her vision blurred. All she could see was the man she blamed for everything, her shame, her loneliness, her fall from grace. The argument spiraled fast. Voices clashed in the narrow aisle, echoing off the shelves. Someone called for the manager. But before anyone could step in, Karen's anger erupted in a single, violent motion. She swung her basket hard. The plastic cracked against his shoulder, knocking him backward. He stumbled, trying to steady himself, but she didn't stop. Her hands shook as she pushed him again, screaming words that didn't even make sense anymore. Her face was red, her eyes wild. Thomas's back hit the edge of a metal shelf. The impact sent several glass jars tumbling to the floor, shattering on impact. The sound filled the air, sharp, chaotic, final. "Stop," someone yelled, but she couldn't hear them. Thomas slipped on the glass, his feet losing grip. For a split second, time seemed to slow. He fell hard, his head hitting the corner of the shelf with a dull, sickening thud. The sound silenced the entire store. Corinne froze, her mouth open, her hands trembling. The basket dropped from her grip. She stared down at him, her mind refusing to process what she'd just done. Blood began to spread beneath his head, dark and slow, seeping into the cracks of the tile. Someone screamed. Another person ran to call 911. Corinne stepped back, her breath ragged. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice breaking. She looked around, searching for a way out, but every pair of eyes was on her, horrified, disbelieving. The store's fluorescent lights felt blinding, hot against her skin. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. A woman rushed over to help Thomas, pressing tissues against his head, crying as she did. The minutes that followed were a blur of sirens, shouting, and panic. The police arrived fast, their lights flashing through the glass doors. The paramedics pushed past the crowd, kneeling beside the fallen man. Corinne sat against the wall, staring blankly, her clothes splattered with blood. She didn't resist when the officers approached her. She didn't speak when they handcuffed her. She just stared at the paramedics working over Thomas's still body, her lips trembling as she whispered to herself, "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Maybe she hadn't meant to kill him, but she had wanted to hurt him. She had wanted him to feel even a fraction of the pain she'd carried inside. And now, she had gone too far to ever take it back. As they led her out of the store, the crowd parted. Phones recorded her once again, but this time, there were no shouts, no anger, just silence. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the parking lot, heavy and hollow. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. The same lot where she had once screamed at him now felt like another world, a place she could never return to. She looked up for a moment, her face streaked with tears, then down again, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Inside the store, the paramedics worked quickly, but the air was thick with dread. One of them shook his head, quietly, almost imperceptibly. A hush fell over the room. A child began to cry somewhere near the checkout counter. The manager stood frozen, hands pressed to his mouth, staring at the blood on the floor. The same clean, polished floor he'd walked across for years. Everything that had once made the store ordinary, the hum of the lights, the soft music, the smell of coffee, now felt tainted. Back in the police car, Corinne stared out the window as they drove away. Her reflection looked ghostly in the glass. She could still hear the sound, that awful, heavy thud replaying over and over in her mind. Each time it came, she flinched. The adrenaline had drained out of her, leaving only emptiness. Her thoughts came in flashes, the moment his eyes widened, the way the jars had shattered, the silence afterward. For the first time in years, she felt small, powerless, terrified. At the station, they asked her questions she barely heard. She kept saying she didn't mean it, that it was an accident. But every time she spoke, the words sounded weaker, emptier. She knew what the cameras had caught. She knew what people would say. Meanwhile, word spread fast. Within an hour, the story was on local news. Woman involved in viral racist incident arrested after grocery store assault turns deadly. The headlines were everywhere before sunset. Neighbors gathered outside her house, reporters knocking on doors, people arguing online, some calling it justice, others tragedy. But for the people who had witnessed it, the scene replayed in their heads in silence. The sound of glass breaking. The old man is falling. The woman whispered no as her whole world fell apart. The parking lot that evening was empty again, the sunset painting long streaks of red across the pavement. The blood had been washed away, but the stain lingered in everyone's memory. What had started as words, angry, hateful words, had ended in irreversible silence. And as night fell over Maple Avenue, the quiet felt heavier than ever, as if the world itself was holding its breath, mourning not just one man's life, but the humanity that had been lost in that moment of blind, uncontainable rage. The days after the crime felt unreal, like the world had slowed down, but everything still hurtled forward without mercy. The grocery store on Maple Avenue stayed closed for 2 days, the glass doors locked and the lights dimmed. A small pile of flowers and candles appeared near the entrance, placed quietly by neighbors who'd known Thomas for years. There were notes, 2 handwritten messages saying, "Rest in peace, Mr. Grant," and you deserved better. The parking lot, once filled with carts and laughter, had turned into a place of mourning. For the people who had been there, the scene wouldn't leave their minds. The sound of the fall, the blood, the look on Karen's face, it replayed like a loop that refused to stop. The employees who'd known Thomas for years couldn't talk about it without their voices breaking. Some said the store didn't feel the same anymore. Even the background music, when it returned, felt hollow. In the small house at the edge of town, Karen sat alone in her cell, her face pale under the harsh lights. The first night after her arrest, she didn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of her own voice shouting in her head. She kept telling herself it wasn't supposed to go that far. She hadn't meant to kill him, she only wanted him to hurt, to feel what she felt. But the words didn't comfort her anymore. They sounded childish, empty. When the officers came in the next morning, she barely moved. They handed her the paperwork, explained the charges: manslaughter, hate crime, aggravated assault. She nodded mechanically, barely hearing. The reality sank in slowly, like cold water creeping up her body. Every part of her life, her house, her job, her freedom was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. First time she saw herself on the news, it broke something inside her. They played the footage of the crime again and again, the shove, the fall, the blood. Her face was frozen in rage. The anchors spoke her name with disgust, their tone cold and detached. Neighbors she'd known for years refused to speak to reporters. A few even told the press they weren't surprised, that she'd always had a temper. Hearing that made her sick. She wanted to scream that they didn't know her, that she wasn't that person. But she couldn't. Because the truth was, maybe she had been that person all along. She just hadn't wanted to see it. Meanwhile, Thomas's family was left to piece together their grief. His granddaughter sat on the porch swing of their home, holding one of the red apples he used to bring her. She was only 9 years old, too young to understand why people kept stopping by with food and sad faces. She kept asking when her grandfather was coming home. When her aunt tried to explain, she cried so hard she couldn't breathe. At the funeral, the church was full. People who had known Thomas for decades came, neighbors, even old students from the community center where he had volunteered. They remembered him as patient, kind, the kind of man who smiled even when the world gave him little reason to. The pastor's voice trembled as he spoke of forgiveness and love, but in the crowd, many found those words hard to accept. There was too much anger, too much pain. The video of the attack was everywhere by then. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It had become national news. Talk shows debated it, news panels discussed what it said about racism, anger, and society's growing divisions. Strangers online argued in comment sections, some condemning her without hesitation, others trying to twist the story to make excuses for her actions. But for the people who had known Thomas, no debate could make sense of the loss. In the quiet moments of her confinement, Karen's mind swung between guilt and defensiveness. Sometimes she cried until her body shook, whispering apologies into the darkness. Other times, anger returned, not at Thomas anymore, but at herself, at the world, at the cameras that had caught her worst moment and made it eternal. She told her lawyer again and again, "I didn't mean to kill him." The lawyer only nodded, knowing that intent wouldn't matter much when the jury saw the footage. The community, once calm and ordinary, began to fracture under the weight of the tragedy. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse demanding justice. Some carried signs with Thomas's name, others carried photos of him smiling with his granddaughter. Local leaders spoke at vigils about the poison of hate that still lingered in quiet towns, about how one person's anger could destroy multiple lives in a single breath. For weeks, Karen's face was everywhere on news screens, in newspaper headlines, online. She became a symbol of everything people wanted to discuss but were afraid to face. The world reduced her to a label, the racist woman who killed an old man. She wasn't Karen anymore, just a name tied to outrage. In her moments of silence, she began to see that truth too. She remembered the first argument, the look on his face when she shoved him, the soft sadness in his eyes. That image haunted her more than the sound of the fall. It wasn't the noise, the shouting, or even the blood that broke her. It was the realization that he hadn't fought back. He hadn't hated her, not even in the end. One night, weeks after her arrest, she asked for a Bible. No one expected it from her. She wasn't religious. But she held it for hours, not reading, just tracing her fingers over the pages. Maybe she was looking for forgiveness. Maybe she just wanted something solid to hold on to when her world felt like it was falling apart. Outside the jail, life went on. The grocery store reopened. The staff tried to go back to normal routines, but they moved more slowly, spoke more softly. The aisle where it had happened was rearranged, the shelves restocked. But everyone knew. Even when the floors shone again, the memory didn't fade. People avoided that spot without realizing it. Thomas's home remained quiet, often placed a single apple on the dining table before going to bed, a small act of remembrance she didn't fully understand. His daughter would find it there in the morning and cry quietly before taking it away. For Corinne's family, what little of it was left, the shame was crushing. Her sister, living in another city, turned off her phone for weeks after reporters kept calling. Her parents, both elderly, refused to speak to the media. They hadn't seen her in years, and now their daughter's name was forever linked to violence. They wished they could have helped her before it was too late, but she'd always pushed them away, too proud to admit she needed anyone. As the trial approached, the tension in town grew. The courtroom was packed on the first day, reporters, activists, and locals filling every seat. Corinne sat silently beside her lawyer, her eyes hollow. She didn't look at anyone, not even the jury. When the footage played on the large screen, she closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time since her arrest, she whispered something almost no one heard. "I'm sorry." But apologies didn't bring peace. The verdict, when it came, wasn't surprising. Guilty on all charges. The courtroom was silent except for the faint sob of Thomas's granddaughter in the back row. Corinne didn't cry when the sentence was read. She just nodded once, like she'd already known how it would end. Afterward, the media moved on to other stories, other crimes. But in Maple Avenue, the echoes remained. The grocery store still stood, the church still held services, and life carried on quieter, more careful. People talked more kindly to one another for a while, holding doors, lowering their voices. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was fear. And somewhere in a prison cell, a woman sat alone, still replaying the moment that destroyed 2 lives, the moment she let anger win. In another small house, a little girl placed another apple on the table and whispered a soft goodnight to the man who taught her what kindness looked like. The world didn't stop for either of them, but the silence left behind told its own story, a reminder of how quickly hate can strip away everything human, how one act, one word, can ripple outward and break far more than it ever meant to. In the end, when all the headlines faded and the town returned to its slow rhythm, the story of Thomas Grant and Corinne Miller didn't truly disappear. It lingered in the quiet spaces where memory refuses to let go. The courtroom, the cameras, the outrage online, all of it was temporary. What remained was something far deeper and more haunting, a lasting question about what justice really means and whether it can ever undo what's been done. Corinne's sentence, 15 years for manslaughter with an additional charge for a hate-motivated assault, was met with a divided response. Some said it was fair, others called it lenient. The courtroom had felt heavy that day, the air thick with unspoken grief. When the judge read the sentence, Thomas's daughter held her own child's hand tightly, not out of triumph, but out of exhaustion. Justice, for her, didn't feel like victory. It felt like breathing through pain, necessary but hollow. For Corinne, prison was not redemption. It was reflection forced upon her by silence. The world outside had moved on, but inside those walls, time stopped. The first few months were unbearable. The nights were long, filled with echoes of her own regret. She attended anger management classes and counseling, but no session could erase the image of Thomas's face in that final moment. Every night before lights out, she would lie awake staring at the small, square window, whispering words she wished she had said when it mattered. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me." Her lawyer said she might get parole after 10 years if she showed progress and good behavior. But what did progress mean to a woman who destroyed her own life and someone else? Corinne tried to make sense of it by working in the prison library, organizing books no one read, finding small comfort in words written by others who had wrestled with guilt and redemption. She wrote letters, 200 of them, to Thomas's family, though none were ever sent. They sat in a box under her bed, unsent apologies that no one was ready to receive. Outside, the town struggled to reconcile what had happened. The grocery store, once an ordinary part of daily life, became an unspoken reminder of violence. New management repainted the walls, replaced the aisles, and changed the layout entirely, but the locals still remembered. There were whispers, quiet glances, and unspoken rules about where to park and which lane to avoid. The staff had moved on, but the community's heart had changed. The tragedy had left a scar, not visible but deeply felt. The town's leaders, pushed by public pressure, began new community programs about tolerance and dialogue. Schools started hosting workshops on empathy and diversity. Churches and mosques held joint gatherings, inviting people to talk openly about prejudice, anger, and the silent biases that live in small towns. For a while, it seemed that something good might come out of the horror, that perhaps the town could learn from its pain. But human nature, as always, was complicated. With time, attendance dwindled. People grew tired of talking about it. The silence returned, polite and heavy just like before. Thomas's family found their own quiet ways to heal. His daughter took his old leather-bound journal from the nightstand and began writing in it. She wrote letters to him, telling him about school days, about how the house felt emptier without his laughter. It became her ritual, her way of keeping him close. Little, growing older, understood more each year. By the time she turned 12, she no longer asked when he was coming home. Instead, she visited his grave on Sundays and left an apple there, a small, simple act of love. For them, justice wasn't a sentence. It was remembering who he was, refusing to let his story be defined only by how he died. And yet, beyond the personal grief, the case had rippled into something larger. News commentators called it a mirror of modern society's quiet rage. Universities discussed it in lectures on criminal psychology and social decay. The story appeared in documentaries, think pieces, and podcasts, dissecting how a moment of anger could expose years of buried prejudice. Everyone had an opinion, but few had understanding. The tragedy forced a question that no one liked to face. How much of Corinne's hatred had been her own, and how much had been taught to her by a society that thrives on division? The answer wasn't simple. It rarely is. In the end, the case wasn't just about one woman's crime. It was about all the unseen pressures that shaped it. A life steeped in resentment, a community that avoided confrontation, and a society that teaches people to fear what they don't understand. Corinne had made her own choices, yes, but those choices were born in the soil of years of quiet anger, unaddressed bias, and isolation. When asked in an interview years later what she had learned, Corinne didn't talk about forgiveness. She simply said, "Hate doesn't explode all at once. It grows quietly until it becomes the only thing left." Her voice was soft, broken by age and regret, but her words carried a truth too raw to ignore. That line was quoted across newspapers and social media, sparking brief waves of conversation. But the world, ever restless, soon moved on to the next tragedy, the next outrage. That's the irony of modern justice. It punishes, it publicizes, but it rarely heals. Still, for a few people, the memory of Thomas Grant continued to mean something. Each year on the anniversary of his death, the local community center hosted a charity event in his name, raising funds for programs that helped foster empathy and understanding among youth. The motto printed on the flyers was simple: kindness is strength. In that, perhaps, there was a small form of justice, one not written in court rulings or headlines, but in the quiet determination to make sure the hate that took him didn't take anyone else. If the story teaches anything, it's that justice is not an endpoint but a process, a long, uneven effort to bridge what divides us. The law can punish wrongdoing, but it cannot rebuild trust or undo trauma. That work belongs to people, to communities, to individuals willing to look inward and face uncomfortable truths. Corinne's story stands as a warning and a mirror. She was neither a monster nor a victim, but a deeply flawed human being who let anger become her identity. Her fall reminds us how easily morality can fracture under pressure, how even ordinary people can become agents of harm when consumed by resentment. Thomas's story, on the other hand, endures as a quiet reminder of dignity. In his final moments, he didn't strike back, didn't shout or curse. He stood there, bewildered but calm, a man who had lived his life with patience and grace until hatred took it from him. In a world so often driven by cruelty and ego, that stillness, his unwillingness to respond to hate with hate, became its own act of resistance. As the years passed, both lives became symbols in different ways. One symbolized the dangers of unchecked anger, the other, the quiet power of kindness. And maybe that's where the real story ends, not with punishment or redemption, but with a simple, enduring truth, that our smallest choices, made in moments of weakness or grace, can change the course of many lives. Justice may have been served on paper, but the real justice, the kind that transforms hearts, remains unfinished, waiting in the hands of those willing to listen, to forgive, and to do better. And so, in a town that still carries the memory of a single terrible act, a little girl grows up believing her grandfather's favorite saying, "Be kind, even when the world is." That, perhaps, is the closest thing to healing any of them will ever have.